Upon November 12th and 13th, 1902, occurred the greatest fall of matter in the history of Australia. Upon the 14th of November, it rained mud in Tasmania. It was, of course, attributed to Australian whirlwinds. But according to the Monthly Weather Review, 32/365, there was a haze all the way to the Philippines, also as far as Hong Kong. It may be that this phenomenon had no special relation with the even more tremendous fall of matter that occurred in Europe, February 1903. For several days, the south of England was a dumping ground from somewhere. If you'd like to have a chemist's opinion, even though it's only a chemist's opinion, see the report of the meeting of the Chemical Society of London, April 2nd, 1903. Mr. E.G. Clayton read a paper upon some of the substance that had fallen from the sky, collected by him. The Sahara explanation applies mostly to falls that occur in southern Europe. Farther away, the conventionalists are a little uneasy. For instance, the editor of the Monthly Weather Review, 29/121, says of a red rain that fell near the coast of Newfoundland early in 1890, "It would be remarkable if this was Sahara dust." Mr. Clayton said that the matter examined by him was merely wind-borne dust from the roads and lanes of Wessex. This opinion is typical of all scientific opinion, or theological opinion, or feminine opinion, all very well except for what it disregards. The most charitable thing I can think of, because I think it gives us a broader tone to relieve our malices with occasional charities, is that Mr. Clayton had not heard of the astonishing extent of this fall, had covered the Canary Islands on the 19th, for instance. I think, myself, that in 1903 we passed through the remains of a powdered world, left over from an ancient interplanetary dispute brooding in space like a red resentment ever since. Or, like every other opinion, the notion of dust from Wessex turns into a provincial thing when we look it over. To think is to conceive incompletely, because all thought relates only to the local. We metaphysicians, of course, like to have the notion that we think of the unthinkable. As to opinions, or pronouncements I should say, because they always have such an authoritative air, of other chemists, there is an analysis in Nature, 68/54, giving water and organic matter at 9.08%. It's that carrying out of fractions that's so convincing. The substance is identified as sand from the Sahara. The vastness of this fall. In Nature, 68/65, we are told that it occurred in Ireland, too. The Sahara, of course, because, prior to February 19th, there had been dust storms in the Sahara, disregarding that in that great region there's always, in some part of it, a dust storm. However, just at present, it does look reasonable the dust had come from Africa, via the Canaries. The great difficulty that authoritativeness has to contend with is some other authoritativeness. When an infallibility clashes with a pontification, they explain. Nature, March 5th, 1903, another analysis. 36% organic matter. Such disagreements don't look very well, so in Nature, 68/109, one of the differing chemists explains. He says that his analysis was of muddy rain, and the other was of sediment of rain. We're quite ready to accept excuses from the Most High, though I do wonder whether we're quite so damned as we were, if we find ourselves in a gracious and tolerant mood toward the powers that condemn. But the tax that now comes upon our good manners and unwillingness to be too severe. Nature, 68/223. Another chemist. He says it was 23.49% water and organic matter. He identifies this matter as sand from an African desert. but after deducting organic matter. But you and I could be identified as sand from an African desert after deducting all there is to us except sand. Why can we not accept that this fall was of sand from the Sahara, omitting the obvious objection that in most parts the Sahara is not red at all, but is usually described as dazzling white? The enormousness of it, that a whirlwind might have carried it, but that, in that case, it would be no supposititious or doubtfully identified whirlwind, but the greatest atmospheric cataclysm in the history of this earth. Journal Royal Meteorological Society, 3056. That, up to the 27th of February, this fall had continued in Belgium, Holland, Germany, and Austria, that in some instances it was not sand, or that almost all the matter was organic, that a vessel had reported the fall as occurring in the Atlantic Ocean midway between Southampton and the Barbados. The calculation is given that in England alone 10 million tons of matter had fallen. It had fallen in Switzerland, Simon's Meteorological Magazine, March 1903. It had fallen in Russia, Bulletin Communication Geology, 2248. Not only had a vast quantity of matter fallen several months before in Australia, but it was at this time falling in Australia. Victorian Naturalist, June 1903, enormously red mud, 50 tons per square mile. The Wessex explanation. Or that every explanation is a Wessex explanation. By that I mean an attempt to interpret the enormous in terms of the minute, but that nothing can be finally explained, because by truth we mean the universal, and that even if we could think as wide as universality, that would not be requital to the cosmic quest, which is not for truth, but for the local that is true, not to universalize the local, but to localize the universal, or to give to a cosmic cloud absolute interpretation in terms of the little dusty roads and lanes of Wessex. I cannot conceive that this can be done. I think of high approximation. Our intermediatist concept is that because of the continuity of all things, which are not separate, positive, or real things, all pseudo-things partake of the undertaking, or are only different expressions, degrees, or aspects of the underlying. So then, that a sample from somewhere in anything must correspond with a sample from somewhere in anything else. That, by due care in selection and disregard for everything else, or the scientific and theological method, the substance that fell February 1903 could be identified with anything, or with some part or aspect of anything that could be conceived of. With sand from the Sahara, sand from a barrel of sugar, or dust of your great-great-grandfather. Different samples are described and listed in the Journal of the Royal Meteorological Society, 3057, or we'll see whether my notion that a chemist could have identified some one of these samples as from anywhere conceivable is extreme or not. Similar to brick dust in one place, buff or light brown in another place, chocolate colored and silky to the touch and slightly iridescent, gray, red rust color, reddish raindrops and gray sand, dirty gray, quite red, yellow-brown with a tinge of pink, deep yellow clay color. In nature, it is described as of a peculiar yellowish cast in one place, reddish somewhere else, and salmon-colored in another place. Or there could be real science, if there were really anything to be scientific about. Or the science of chemistry is like a science of sociology, prejudiced in advance, because only to see is to see with a prejudice, setting out to prove that all inhabitants of New York came from Africa. Very easy matter. Samples from one part of town, disregard for all the rest. There is no science, but Wessex science. According to our acceptance, there should be no other, but that approximation should be higher, that metaphysics is super evil, that the scientific spirit is of the cosmic quest. Our notion is that, in a real existence, such a quasi-system of fables as the science of chemistry could not deceive for a moment, but that in an existence endeavoring to become real, it represents that endeavor, and will continue to impose its pseudo-positiveness, until it be driven out by a higher approximation to realness. That the science of chemistry is as impositive as fortune-telling. Or no. That, though it represents a higher approximation to realness than does alchemy, for instance, and so drove out alchemy, it is still somewhere between myth and positiveness. The attempt at realness, or to state a real and unmodified fact here, is the statement: all red rains are colored sands from the Sahara Desert. My own impositivist acceptances are that some red rains are colored by sands from the Sahara Desert, some by sands from other terrestrial sources, some by sands from other worlds, or from their deserts, also from aerial regions, too indefinite or amorphous to be thought of as worlds or planets. That no supposititious whirlwind can account for the hundreds of millions of tons of matter that fell upon Australia, Pacific Ocean, and Atlantic Ocean, and Europe in 1902 and 1903. That a whirlwind that could do that would not be supposititious. But now we shall cast off some of our Wessicality by accepting that there have been falls of red substance other than sand. We regard every science as an expression of the attempt to be real. But to be real is to localize the universal, or to make some one thing as wide as all things, successful accomplishment of which I cannot conceive of. The prime resistance to this endeavor is the refusal of the rest of the universe to be damned, excluded, disregarded, to receive Christian Science treatment by something else so attempting. Although all phenomena are striving for the absolute, or have surrendered to and have incorporated themselves in higher attempts, simply to be phenomenal, or to have seeming in intermediateness, is to express relations. A river. It is water, expressing the gravitational relation of different levels. The water of the river, expression of chemic relations of hydrogen and oxygen, which are not final. A city, manifestation of commercial and social relations. How could a mountain be without base in a greater body? Storekeeper live without customers. The prime resistance to the positivist attempt by science is its relations with other phenomena, or that it only expresses those relations in the first place, or that a science can have seeming, or survive in intermediateness as something pure, isolated, positively different, no more than could a city, or a river, or a mountain, or a store. This intermediateness-wide attempt by parts to be wholes, which cannot be realized in our quasi-state, if we accept that in it the coexistence of two or more wholes or universals is impossible, high approximation to which, however, may be thinkable. Scientists and their dream of pure science. Artists and their dream of art for art's sake. It is our notion that if they could almost realize that would be almost realness. That they would instantly be translated into real existence. Such thinkers are good positivists, but they are evil in an economic and sociologic sense, if, in that sense, nothing has justification for being, unless it serve, or function for, or express the relations of some higher aggregate. So science functions for and serves society at large, and would, from society at large, receive no support unless it did so divert itself, or dissipate and prostitute itself. It seems that by prostitution, I mean usefulness. There have been red rains that, in the Middle Ages, were called rains of blood. Such rains terrified many persons, and were so unsettling to large populations that science, in its sociologic relations, has sought, by Mrs. Eddy's method, to remove an evil. That rains of blood do not exist. That rains so called are only of water colored by sand from the Sahara Desert. My own acceptance is that such assurances, whether fictitious or not, whether the Sahara is a dazzling white desert or not, have wrought such good effects, in a sociologic sense, even though prostitutional in the positivist sense, they were well justified. But that we've gone on, that this is the 20th century, that most of us have grown up, so that such soporifics of the past are no longer necessary, that if gushes of blood should fall from the sky upon New York City, business would go on as usual. We began with rains that we accepted ourselves were, most likely, only of sand. In my own still immature hereticalness, and by heresy or progress I mean very largely a return, though with many modifications, to the superstitions of the past, I think I feel considerable aloofness to the idea of rains of blood. Just at present it is my conservative or timid purpose to express only that there have been red rains that very strongly suggest blood, or finely divided animal matter. Debris from interplanetary disasters, aerial battles, food supplies from cargoes of supervessels wrecked in interplanetary traffic. There was a red rain in the Mediterranean region, March 6, 1888. 12 days later, it fell again. Whatever this substance may have been, when burned, the odor of animal matter from it was strong and persistent. L'Astronomie, 1888, 205. But infinite heterogeneity, or debris from many different kinds of aerial cargoes. There have been red rains that have been colored by neither sand nor animal matter. Annals of Philosophy, 16-226. That November 2nd, 1819, week before the Black Rain and Earthquake of Canada, there fell, at Blankenberge, Holland, a red rain. As to sand, two chemists of Bruges concentrated 144 ounces of the rain to 4 ounces. No precipitate fell, but the color was so marked that had there been sand, it would have been deposited, if the substance had been diluted instead of concentrated. Experiments were made, and various reagents did cast precipitates, but other than sand. The chemists concluded that the rainwater contained muriate of cobalt, which is not very enlightening. That could be said of many substances carried in vessels upon the Atlantic Ocean. Whatever it may have been, in the Annales de Chimie, 2/12/432, its color is said to have been red-violet. For various chemic reactions, see Quarterly Journal Royal Institute, 9/202, and Edinburgh Philosophical Journal, 2/381. Something that fell with dust, said to have been meteoric, March 9th, 10th, 11th, 1872, described in the Chemical News, 25/300, as a peculiar substance, consisted of a red iron ochre, carbonate of lime, and organic matter. Orange-red hail, March 14, 1879, in Tuscany. Notes and queries, 9/5/16. Rain of lavender-colored substance at Udon, France, December 19, 1903. Bulletin Société Météorologique de France, 1904, 124. La Nature, 1885, 2/351, that, according to Professor Schweethoff, there fell, in Russia, June 14, 1880, red hailstones, also blue hailstones, also gray hailstones. Nature, 34/123. A correspondent writes that he had been told of a resident in a small town in Venezuela that there, April 17, 1886, had fallen hailstones, some red, some blue, some whitish. Informant said to have been unlikely to have heard of the Russian phenomenon, described as an honest, plain countryman. Nature, July 5, 1877, quotes a Roman correspondent to the London Times, who sent a translation from an Italian newspaper, that a red rain had fallen in Italy, June 23, 1877, containing microscopically small particles of sand. Or, according to our acceptance, any other story would have been an evil thing, in the sociologic sense, in Italy in 1877. But the English correspondent, from a land where terrifying red rains are uncommon, does not feel this necessity. He writes, I am by no means satisfied that the rain was of sand and water. His observations are that drops of this rain left stains, such as sandy water could not leave. He notes that when the water evaporated, no sand was left behind. L'Année Scientifique, 1888-75. That, December 13, 1887, there fell in Cochin China a substance like blood, somewhat coagulated. Annales de Chimie, 85-266. That a thick, viscous, red matter fell at Ulm in 1812. We now have a datum with a factor that has been foreshadowed, which will recur and recur and recur throughout this book. It is a factor that makes for speculation so revolutionary that it will have to be reinforced many times before we can take it into full acceptance. Yearbook of Facts, 1861-273, quotation from a letter from Professor Campini to Professor Matteucci, that upon December 28, 1860, at about 7 a.m., in the northwestern part of Siena, a reddish rain fell copiously for 2 hours. A second red shower fell at 11 o'clock. 3 days later, the red rain fell again. The next day, another red rain fell. Still more extraordinarily, each fall occurred in exactly the same quarter of the town.